Germany, the Bundestag is about to get underway. This is the scene in the German parliament at the moment as the country marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp and the end of the Holocaust. Across the next hour here on DW, we'll hear live from the country's political leaders and from a Holocaust survivor. I'm Phil Gale. Welcome to DW's special coverage of Germany's ceremony of remembrance, commemorating the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in 1945. Each year, at the end of January, Parliament holds a ceremony in the plenary chamber of the Bundestag to remember the millions of people who were deprived of their rights, persecuted and murdered during the Nazi regime. This year's ceremony of remembrance also marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz. So that's a little flavour of what is to come. Our political correspondent, Julia Saudelli, can talk us through the next hour. Welcome, Julia. What are we expecting?
Yeah, so this is a ceremony that happens every year around the January 27th, which is a Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it is an event that is then commemorated each year in the German Bundestag. This year, as we can see, as the ceremony starts, there's going to be some musical performances, and in between the musical performances, we're going to see speeches held by the president of the German Bundestag, by the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and as traditionally by a survivor of the Holocaust.
In fact, we can see the guests there live, and we just saw President Steinmeier and a gentleman next to him who I guess is going to be speaking as well. Who is this year's special guest?
Yeah, so his name is Roman Schwarzman. He is 88 years old, and he was as a child, taken and interned in a ghetto in what is now Ukraine, in the town of Barshad, and he was there as a child. He was 5-6 years old and stayed there for a few years until the ghetto was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in 1944, and he has then gone on and started living in Odesa, now in Ukraine, and he is an activist and a big leader and supporter of the Jewish community in Ukraine, in Odesa, and he's been very active in supporting Jewish life in Ukraine, and also a vocal speaker in remembering what happened in the Holocaust.
And we'll see and hear speeches from the German federal president and the parliament, the president of the parliament. Germany clearly regards this anniversary as a big deal. This is significant.
Yes, it is, because Germany, when the Nazis were in power here, was the perpetrator of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed across Europe. That is 2/3 of all the Jews who were living in Europe, and it was the Nazi Germany carrying out the systematic killing of Jews across the continent. It was a plan to annihilate Jews from the continent, and it is something that is very felt in Germany, that there has to be a strong remembrance of the crimes that were committed, but also a strong sense of responsibility to make sure that these horrible crimes don't happen again.
And so what else is Germany doing to make sure the world doesn't forget?
Well, there is a strong tradition in Germany, for example, in schools, but also in different parts of cultural and societal life of remembrance. There are over 300 institutions like museums or archives to help remember what happened.
Okay, let's listen into what's happening at the Parliament now. You're watching DW.
Mr. President, Ms. Budenbender, Mr. Schwarzman, Mr. Federal Chancellor, Madam President of the Federal Council, Mr. President of the Federal Constitutional Court, Excellencies, Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Auschwitz, 27th of January, 1945, around 3 p.m. Red Army tanks drive up to the gate with the inscription, "Work sets you free." The soldiers are young men, including Russians, Ukrainians, Chechens, Georgians. They break through the gate to the Auschwitz main camp with a tank. One lorry follows the next. Soldiers jump out. A short time later, 3 kilometers away, the 21-year-old David Dushman also crosses the barbed wire of Auschwitz-Birkenau with his tank. The young men are battle-hardened. The sight of the dead is an everyday occurrence for them, but none of them are prepared for what awaits them in Auschwitz. Hundreds of corpses, an acrid odor, the stench of burnt flesh. Dark ash falls onto the snow from above. One by one, figures emerge from the barracks, remain there, standing there, perplexed, emaciated, shaved bald, with sunken faces and lifeless eyes. This is what happened according to the reports of various eyewitnesses, and I quote Grigory Elizavetsky, one of the first Soviet officers to reach Auschwitz. I enter the barrack. On the 3-story plank beds lie half-dead people, like skeletons. As if through fog, I hear the words of my soldiers, "You are free now, comrades." I realize they don't understand. I speak to them in Yiddish. But it's only when I said, "Don't be afraid, I am a colonel with the Soviet army, and I am Jewish. We have come to set you free." A dam finally seemed to break. They came running towards us, screaming. They fell to their knees. They kissed the hems of our coats and hugged our legs. And we stood there, motionless, and the tears flowed down our cheeks. End of quote. And I quote Eva Moses. She was 10 years old at the time, and she'd been in Auschwitz for 9 months. We ran up to them, and they gave us hugs, biscuits, and chocolate. As we were so alone, one more hug meant so much more than you could imagine. We weren't just hungry for food, but also for human attention. And the Soviet army gave us some of that. End of quote. Around 7,000 people were liberated from the Auschwitz camp complex, according to research, and several hundreds of them died in the months following the liberation. The SS had previously murdered most of the prisoners and sent several tens of thousands on death marches to the West. 80 years have passed since these terrible events, but such horror does never go away. Such injuries to the soul cannot be healed, not even in the duration of a whole human life. Ladies and gentlemen, I visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau memorial site myself last summer. In an uncanny way, the place seems peaceful, eerily. The sun is shining there too. You don't hear the scream of the people who suffocated in agony in the gas chambers. You can't see that the ashes of the murdered were scattered on that meadow behind the crematorium. I was very impressed by the work of the Memorial Center there, just like the work of the International Youth Meeting Center, which is also there. But places alone are not enough to remember. I met survivors on my trip to Auschwitz. When they tell their stories, you begin to realize what Auschwitz meant. When we listen to them, we ourselves become witnesses to their stories. To me, it's a miracle that the survivors are even ready to talk about Auschwitz. And it's a miracle that there are any survivors at all here today. The vast majority of fates in Auschwitz ended on the ramp, in the gas chamber, and in the crematorium. These children, women and men, were never able to tell their stories of suffering. A loud silence that's been going on for 80 years and forever. Ladies and gentlemen, to counter this silence, we commemorate every year on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz the fates of all the victims of National Socialism here in the German Bundestag. We commemorate the 6 million murdered Jews of Europe. We commemorate the victims of the German occupation and extermination policy, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. We commemorate the murdered Sinti and Burma people. We remember all the people who died because of their political convictions, because of their Christian faith, or as Jehovah's Witnesses. We commemorate the persecuted queer people, all those people who were defamed as antisocial, and we commemorate the victims of so-called euthanasia. We commemorate the prisoners of war and forced laborers who were exploited and disenfranchised. We commemorate the resistance fighters who were executed. We commemorate all survivors who are forever scarred by these experiences. We commemorate the families and descendants of the victims and survivors who were forced to find a way of dealing with their own family histories. Ladies and gentlemen, our commemoration today is accompanied by music of two male composers and one female composer, whose lives were marked by flight and persecution because of their Jewish ancestry. Gideon Klein, whose piece we just heard, deserves a special mention. The day before yesterday was the anniversary of his death. He was murdered 80 years ago, just hours before the liberation. He was murdered by the SS in Auschwitz. I would like to thank the young musicians of the Berlin University of the Arts for playing these works for us. It's good to experience how young generations participate in Remembrance. And I also would like to welcome the participants of the Youth Exchange Program. They went to Auschwitz, they listened to survivors, and this way they carry the memory of National Socialist crimes into the future. Mr. President, you too were in Auschwitz the day before yesterday with the Central Memorial Service. And I very much thank you that you're about to take the floor now and address us. Ladies and gentlemen, there are fewer and fewer people now here with us who've experienced the atrocities of National Socialism firsthand. Some of them are here today. On behalf of the whole Bundestag, I am delighted to welcome you all at the gallery today, especially Mrs. Friedlander and Mrs. Knobloch. Also, we're deeply grateful, dear Roman Schwarzman, that you have come all the way over from Odesa and that you will speak to us in a moment. Thank you. You are the chairman of the Association of Former Jewish Ghetto and Concentration Camp Prisoners in Odessa. When you were a child, you lived in the Bershad ghetto yourself, and you will tell us about that today. You work for setting up a memorial to be built in your hometown, a worthy memorial for the tens of thousands of mostly Jewish people who died in October 1941 during the Odesa massacre. Dear Roman Schwarzman, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which violates international law, has stopped your plan for a memorial to be set up for the time being. Instead of realizing the memorial site, you are now worrying about your children and grandchildren in Ukraine. I very much hope that this memorial in Odesa will be erected very soon. We must continue to point it out and to conduct further research on the unimaginable crimes the National Socialists committed. Especially today in these times, historical awareness is particularly important. It's on us now to preserve the traditions and the reports of contemporary witnesses for future generations. There are conspiracy myths and propaganda around in the analog and digital space. The liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army and the fight against the National Socialists, for example, are now abused as a justification for oppression and for war. Ladies and gentlemen, some people in Germany don't want to hear about the Holocaust anymore at all. They finally want to get rid of the historical responsibility. But I say we must not evade and avoid our historical responsibility. And that is why we must not stop. We must never stop to take a close look, to listen and to feel. Here in Germany, anti-Semitism is on the rise again, not only now, but especially since the 7th October 2023. Jewish people are openly threatened and attacked. Nothing is won forever, warns Piotr Czerwinski, the manager of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial. Let's be honest with ourselves. Many Jews do not feel safe in Germany now. In our fight against anti-Semitism, we're experiencing disappointing setbacks. And that hurts. Recently, a Jewish father asked me, "Can you assure me that my children will continue to be safe in this country also in the future?" How I wish I could have answered yes with full conviction. But the question remains unanswered. The answer is in all our hands. Last year, we passed a resolution in the German Bundestag by a large majority to protect and strengthen Jewish life in Germany. That's a very important sign. And now is the time to take this resolution as a mandate and fill it with life. Living compassion is not a task that can simply be delegated, for example, to politicians. Each and every one of us should ask ourselves over and over again, what am I ready to do for what we call never again? Thank you.
That's the President of the German Parliament, Bärbel Bass, speaking at this commemoration of the victims of the Holocaust in the German Parliament. The next speaker will be the German Federal President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is approaching the microphone now.
Sehr geehrter lieber Herr Schwarzman,
Dear Mr. Schwarzman, President of the German Parliament and Madam Speaker, President of the Second Chamber, President of the Constitutional Court, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In an ordinary house in Odesa these days, somewhat hidden, you find a small museum of the Holocaust. And in a showcase behind glass, you will find a piece of a thick rope, an arm's length of it. It's a photo I saw some time ago, and it is something that never left me. Dear Mr. Schwarzman, 4 years ago, we met in Babi Yar for a memorial event. And when we met again yesterday, you told me the story behind that piece of rope. This rope is the only object that still is left of a little girl from Odessa. Her name was Rosa. Rosa still went to school and she had a good friend, Jacob. They both sat next to each other. Rosa was 16 years old when she was murdered in the autumn of 1941. In these days and weeks, thousands of Jewish children, women and men in Odessa were killed or driven away from the city into ghettos in the surroundings. When Rosa was hanged, just for being a Jew, her friend Yaakov saw her die. They left her hanging from that noose for a whole week. Yaakov saw her body, but could do nothing. When they finally put her down, all that was left was this rope. And in his desperation and sadness, Yaakov took that rope with him. It was the only memory he could keep of his friend. A piece of the rope that brought her death. Ladies and gentlemen, many decades later, an old man carrying an old bag came to the museum in Odessa, the very museum that you, Mr. Schwarzman, set up together with others in order to collect memorabilia of the survivors of the Shoah and to keep these memories alive. The man who'd come was Yaakov. He brought you that rope, told you the story of Rosa's murder, and he said, "Now I can die in peace, because this friend of my youth will be remembered in a worthy way." And you told us last night that he died 2 months later. Ladies and gentlemen, what the Germans and their henchmen did, who they executed in Ukraine, that was a war of extermination, and that started even before the Germans started to implement their plan to systematically murder the European Jews. Jewish life was almost totally extinguished in Odessa, in Babin Yar, in Chernovitz, in Kherson, near Kharkiv, in the Dnipro. Today, we remember Rosa and all the other children, women and men who were murdered back then in Ukraine and in all of Europe. We owe these victims to remember them in dignity. We will not forget them. Dear Mr. Schwarzman, you yourself are a survivor of the Shoah. You were at the Bershad ghetto in what was then Transnistria. You were imprisoned there as a 5-year-old boy with your mother and with your siblings. You were suffering. There was hunger. There was fear. You saw your own brother die. As a little boy, you were surrounded by pain, horror, and dreadful attacks. You became the victim of mass murder. The unspeakable suffering you had to live through did not break you. You made it your lifetime's work to give a voice to the survivors of the Shoah in Odessa and everywhere in Ukrainian territory. And without people like you, Mr. Schwarzman, there would be no place where Yaakov's memory of Rosa would continue to live. Today, you are fighting to put up a monument to the victims of the massacre in Odessa, and Germany supports you in that endeavor. I'm deeply grateful to you for traveling to us from your city under attack to be with us, and I think it is a privilege to have you talk to us today, and I assure you, my country stands at your side in this important remembrance work. But we also stand with you in this dreadful war which Putin is waging against Ukraine, against freedom and independence, against the people in Ukraine. We will continue to support you. We are with you. We will remain with you. Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come together here in order to remember the victims of National Socialism. It happened 80 years ago, a lifetime. 80 years since the extermination camp of Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army on 27 January 1945. All of us have these images in our hearts, in our minds. We remember the images that represent the horror of the Shoah, and these days we again see those photographs that have long become symbols. We see the film scenes in black and white taken by the liberators. We see the corpses stacked. We see the emaciated faces of survivors. And again we see that for 80 years, and it's necessary that we do so. Yet there is a danger in that too. The oft-seen scenes, the well-known warning words, the routine of commemoration, that bears within it the danger of a wrong and an erroneous certainty. It makes it so easy to believe that we had completely understood what had happened. They make it easy for us to believe that we knew it all. They make it easy to succumb to the temptation of collecting all these images, the stories, the words, in a big box in our minds with a lid, saying, all that was so long ago. But, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't change what has happened. A historical truth cannot be boxed up and put away. We need to keep facing up to this truth. We must never slacken and tell it to those who come after us. But we will increasingly lack the opportunity to hear eyewitnesses. In particular, for young people, we'll have to find new ways of remembering, ways which will focus primarily on knowledge, the wish to know, so that we all understand, that we are all still seeking, learning. It's a job for our generation to work against forgetting all over Europe. It is a job, and I would like to add, that we must not fail in doing. And for that very reason, in this day and age, I would express my gratitude to the people who live in these memorials, to do research, who show so much commitment, and that such centres are attacked for political reasons, that such centres are desecrated, that people are insulted and threatened. That must be a warning signal, because these systematic attacks, they want to intimidate, they want to destroy and ultimately discredit the remembrance and rewrite history. But if a memorial has to spend more and more of its budget instead of for educational work on security measures, then I think that is a shame. We must not accept it in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, the Speaker just said 2 days ago on Monday I visited Auschwitz together with survivors of the Shoah and representatives of German politics. It wasn't far away from Berlin, our capital city, where all what happened there was thought up in the first place. To stand there amidst the barracks, that means to stand in front of an inescapable truth. It was Germans who committed and organized this crime of humanity. Germans dug the trench of inhumanity. They planned it, measured it, calculated it, and the victims, they marched through it until the end. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, this place, Auschwitz, makes clear the Shoah is part of German history. Whether we like it or not, it has become part of our identity. There is no end to remembering, and therefore there cannot be an end to our responsibility. Never again is something we don't just say on days like this. But never again doesn't just mean that Jews have to be living safely and securely in Germany, in Europe and Israel. It also means that in our countries, Jews are and remain part of us. And never again, it doesn't mean beware the beginnings. Michel Friedman rightly pointed this out. Actually, in my view, it should say, consider the end. If anti-Semitism becomes everyday occurrence in our country, in our roads, in our squares and schools and universities, that is something that in our country, with our history, we must never allow. As Germans, we have drawn lessons from our history. We've built our constitution on it. The dignity of man is inviolable. That's our answer to the unbelievable German crimes against humanity. Our democracy is the answer to race mania and nationalism. And I'm convinced these lessons remain right and true, even in a country which, like any other, is changing. These lessons have carried us, and they have guaranteed to us decades of peace, both within and without. They allow trust to grow with our partners in Europe and in the world, and even, and this is really important, even with those who once became victims of Germans. And their trust is a gift. Committing to our permanent responsibility and the success story of our democracy are inextricably linked, and I would wish this to remain. I hope that this will remain, because if we repress, belittle or forget the Shoah these days, we would also undermine the very foundations from which our democracy grew. And in other terms, if you ridicule, despise or attack our democracy today, you are actually opening the gates to hatred and to hatred of others. I would like to go back to Monday and the speeches we heard the survivors give, commemorating Auschwitz and the victims. And the survivor, Leon Weintraub, 99 years old, he told us in Auschwitz 2 days ago, in a very impressive, almost desperate way, And he said, take the enemies of democracy seriously. And I repeat that here in the German Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, take the enemies of democracy seriously. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time of decisions. It is up to us to maintain what we've achieved and protect our democracy. Let us not fall back into the dark times. We know better. Let's do it better. Thank you.
Watching DW News live from Berlin. That is the German federal president Frank-Walter Steinmeier speaking at Germany's ceremony of remembrance to remember the millions killed and persecuted by the Nazis. Ahead of him, you heard from the president of the German Parliament, Bärbel Bass. There'll be music next, and then we'll hear from the gentleman that you see in the middle of your screen. That is Roman Schwarzman, who is an Auschwitz survivor.
He survived the ghetto.
That's Death is a Reaper by Felicitas Cooper. You're watching DW as we bring you Germany's commemoration ceremony of remembrance to remember the millions killed and persecuted by the Nazis. Approaching the microphone now is Roman Schwarzman, who survived the ghetto.
Panie President Bundestag,
Madam Speaker of the German Parliament, President,
Federальний канцлер,
Chancellor,
шановні члени парламенту,
members of Parliament,
гості,
dear guests.
дозвольте мені почати з висловлення
At the beginning, allow me to express my sincere gratitude for being given the opportunity to speak before you here today. I stand before you as someone who has lived through one of the most gruesome parts of human history. My personal story is a story of survival, of fighting, and of hope. My story is the story of millions of people who can no longer tell their own stories. I was born on 10 September 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Bershad. We were 9 children at home. We lived in great poverty and in cramped conditions. A large family in just 2 rooms of a tiny dwelling with mud floors and walls. There were only 2 beds, each of which slept 4 people. But we lived. At home, we only spoke Yiddish. Even today, I still speak this language very well. At school, we only spoke Ukrainian. Judaism was represented in our village. About half of the inhabitants were Jewish. We knew about this, but we didn't talk about it much. After the war, when we got older, the Soviet authorities told us that there were many things we Jews were not allowed to do. For example, we were not allowed to attend university. The Jews have always tried to remain true to their religion. Even when they assimilated into other societies, they preserved their Jewish values. In 1936, my father became a communist. My brother, Lazar, and I, we were not circumcised, unlike my 4 brothers who were born before 1936. In our village, there was no rabbi. Religion was forbidden. The Soviet authorities suppressed not only the Jewish religion, but also the Orthodox religion, destroying both synagogues and churches. My mother cultivated the Jewish tradition in her own way. She didn't boast about it. She just did it for herself. In our village, there were many older Jews who had fought in the First World War. They said, "We don't need to go anywhere. The Germans are decent and civilized people." They couldn't imagine what was to come. When my father and older brother were drafted into the Red Army, that was on 23rd June 1941, he instructed my mother to take us to a safe place. As Hitler's hostility towards the Jews was already well known, our escape didn't last long. It was a terrible fortnight where we travelled to nowhere in a horse-drawn cart while we were being bombed. I remember the cornfields through which we fled from soldiers with machine guns. And I remember hundreds, thousands of bodies of dead civilians lying on the ground as we walked on to survive. Then the Nazi tanks came. We had no choice but to return to our village. After that, we spent 2.5 long years in a ghetto behind barbed wire. 2.5 years, full of humiliation, pain, lice, and with constant hunger. Over 80 years have passed, but I still remember the taste of the water that the occupiers just poured away after washing their meat. For them, it was wastewater. But we, 5-6-year-old children, we slipped through the barbed wire, risking our lives to beg for this delicious-tasting water with fat in it. Perhaps it was thanks to this water that we managed to survive. 7 of us children managed to survive, 4 brothers and 3 sisters. When we were just lying on the floor, no longer able to stand up due to a severe form of dystrophy, we were rescued in the spring of 1944. There were about 2,000 places in Ukraine where more than 1.5 million Jews were shot dead, beaten to death, or burned by the SS and the Wehrmacht before Auschwitz and other factories of death began their work of extermination. According to historians, just in my hometown of Beersheba, more than 25,000 children, women, and older people from the Vinnytsia region, from Bessarabia and the Bukovina were buried. I saw these never-ending trenches full of dead bodies with my own eyes. It's where I buried my 14-year-old brother, Josip, who had slipped in the winter and fallen into the river while doing forced labor. For the Germans, that was an attempted escape, and they shot him dead right there in the icy waters. And then our grief-stricken mother, who had already lost an older son at the front, she was not given the opportunity to bury my brother for several days. Dear friends, I've been confronted with death many times, but I have also experienced moments of goodness and solidarity in the ghetto. These moments helped us to persevere and not to lose faith, to survive in order to tell the world of the Holocaust, of fascism, torture, and other horrors of war. Sadly, most did not live to see the hour of rescue. Preserving the memory of the victims of the Holocaust has become my life's work. I thank the German Parliament that we can come together here and remember those that we have lost. For me, it is also important to put up a worthy memorial in my hometown of Odesa, the very place where 25,000 inhabitants of Odesa were burned alive simply because they were Jews. On the night from 22nd to 23rd October 1941, Jews, old people, women, children, and young people, they were driven into 9 empty warehouses, used as ammunition storage dumps before the war. These buildings were doused with a highly flammable mixture and set on fire. Witnesses to this terrible event told me that the cries of pain could be heard all over. Mothers tried to save their children by throwing them out of tiny windows under the roof. And meanwhile, the Nazi henchmen were competing in killing. It's hard to talk about this. Since the construction of a memorial has been planned at this place of terror, with the support of our German friends, I am convinced that the people who perished in the hell of war will remain forever in the hearts of future generations. The construction of this memorial was interrupted by the Russian war of aggression, but I am confident that this project will be completed. Since on 24th February 2022, Russia attacked our civilian population, our cities, and our energy system, once again, our lives and our freedom are in danger. Putin is trying to destroy us as a nation, just like Hitler tried to destroy the Jewish people in the Second World War. Back then, Hitler wanted to kill me because I was Jewish. Now, Putin is trying to kill me because I'm Ukrainian. On the 29th of December 2023, our house was hit
влучила ракета.
by a missile.
Дивом я зміг врятувати
Miraculously, I was
себе і
able
свою
to save
дружину
myself and my
від
wife.
влади.
We had
А коли
fled to
ми
the basement.
піднялись в нашу квартиру на
When we
10-му
returned
поверсі,
to our
то не
10th floor
пізнали
flat,
її.
we didn't
Все
recognize
було
it.
розтрощено.
Everything was destroyed.
Одеса, моє рідне місто,
Odesa,
зараз
my
страдає
hometown,
від
is currently
російського
suffering
тероризму.
greatly from
Я
the
знову
Russian terror.
бачу руйнування,
And once again, I see destruction and
бачу
suffering.
обличчя українських
I see the faces
захисників,
of Ukrainian
які
defenders
повертаються з
returning from Russian
російського
captivity.
полону. Історії скатівень російських
The stories
окупантів
of torture by Russian
викликають
occupiers
у мене фантомну
cause me phantom pains.
Я був у гетто,
I was in the ghetto.
я бачив дьявола.
I have seen the devil. And I
Ми
say
його дуже переоцінюємо.
we greatly overestimate
Його
him.
сила
His
не більш,
power
ніж
is
та,
no greater
яку
than
ми
the
йому
power
даємо.
we give him.
Я хотів би подякувати Німеччині
I would like to
за
thank
підтримку
Germany
нас в останні
for its
роки,
support
в тому числі
which we have
військовою
received in
технікою.
recent years, including
Але Україна
the supply of
не
military
повинна бути
equipment.
поставлена на коліна
Under no
перед
circumstances
російською
must
перевагою.
Ukraine be brought to its knees by Russian superiority.
Не може бути миру без
There
свободи
can be no
і
peace
справедливості.
without freedom and
Той, хто
justice.
вважає, що Путін буде
Anyone who
задоволений
believes that
Україною,
Putin will be satisfied with
обманює
Ukraine is wrong.
Україні потрібні
Ukraine needs
протиповітряна
air
оборона.
defense.
Одесі потрібна
Odesa needs air
протиповітряна
defense
оборона, щоб захистити
to
людей
protect
і
our people
порти.
and harbours.
Нам потрібні літаки,
We need
щоб
aircraft
отримати перевагу
to
в
gain
повітрі.
air
Нам
superiority.
потрібно більше ракет
We need more
дальнього
long-range
радіусу
missiles
дії, щоб
to
паралізувати
destroy
російські
the Russian
аеропорти
airfields
та
and
ракетні
aircraft
бази,
depots
з яких
from which
нас
daily
щодня
attacks are mounted.
атакують. Нам потрібна
We
ваша
need
підтримка
your support
для звільнення
to
людей
liberate the
на
people in the
окупованих
occupied
територіях.
territories.
Світ має перестати
The world
боятися.
must stop being afraid.
Зробить все,
Ukraine
війна
will do
не
everything
прийшла
it can
до вас.
to prevent the war from coming to you.
Дорогі друзі,
Dear friends,
наш історичний і моральний
our
обов'язок
historical and moral
зробити так,
duty
щоб
is to
ніхто
ensure
не зазнав
that no
страждань
one
і тортур.
needs to suffer
Сьогодні
or be tortured.
в цьому
Today,
історичному місці
In this historic place,
не припинити
I would like to ask you
боротьбу
to
за
continue to
Україну,
fight for
за
Ukraine
моє
and my hometown
рідне
of Odessa.
місто Одесу. Сьогодні
Together,
ми повинні ще раз докласти всіх зусиль,
Once again,
щоб поставити
we must do all we
варварство
can
на місце.
to put
Це
barbarism in
єдиний
its
шлях
place.
до
This is the only
взаєморозуміння
way to
і миру.
peace and mutual
Я
understanding.
благаю вас,
I beg
озброїти
you,
нас,
give us the weapons we need so Putin
війну
can end
на знищення.
his war of annihilation.
Одного разу я врятувався
Once
від
I
знищення,
escaped
Зараз
annihilation
я вже
already.
старий,
Now I'm old,
але мені доводиться
but I have to
жити
live with
зі
the fear
страхом,
that
що мої
my
діти
children and my
і діти
children's children
моїх дітей стануть
will become
жертвами
victims
війни
of a
на
war of
знищення.
extermination.
Der Orden vom der Korbanas
Remembering the victims of National Socialism must be our lodestar and commit us to building a future in which humanity and justice are not empty words. Thank you for your attention.
From DW's special coverage of Germany's ceremony of remembrance in the German Parliament. We've just heard from Roman Schwarzman, who survived the ghetto, drawing parallels between the Nazi occupation that he escaped and Russia's war against his home country of Ukraine now. Lives and futures are once again in danger, this time from Putin. He said he gave over much of the second half of his speech to the war in Ukraine, having told us about his being born in 1936 in a small village in Ukraine. His father and brother drafted into the Red Army, his family trying to escape as German tanks drew near, and then had to turn around and go back to his village, where he said he spent 2.5 years of pain and humiliation and constant hunger, saw never-ending trenches full of dead bodies. Watching this with me in the studio here in Berlin is DW's political correspondent, Julia Saldelli. A very moving ceremony. It couldn't fail to be, really, could it?
Yes, and this is something that is obviously brought forward thanks to the testimony of survivors like Roman Schwarzman, who can bring forward their testimony of what it meant to live through something as horrible as the Holocaust and Nazi crimes. And it is something that is becoming increasingly precious just because of the passing of time. Survivors like Roman Schwarzman are getting older. He is 88, and their numbers are becoming smaller, and it is therefore even more important to listen to their words, to be able to have a first-hand account of what happened.
The ceremony will end on a musical note. We're about to hear from students of the University of the Arts 3 preludes for piano by Hans Gale. piece of music that concluded the ceremony in the German Bundestag as Germany remembers the 6 million people, mainly Jews, who were killed in the Holocaust. DW's chief international editor Richard Walker has been following that event from the German Parliament and joins us now. Welcome, Richard. What stood out for you today?
Well, Phil, yes. So what you just saw taking place there was just behind me here. So that's the parliamentary chamber, and we've just come just outside it. But yeah, I was in the chamber for the duration of the ceremony up until this point. And I think, yeah, a few things really stand out. On the one hand, how different this is from usual daily business in the parliament here. You know, this is a place where parliamentarians debate each other, where they attack each other, where there's a lot of noise and kind of political life. And this was a moment of quiet. As soon as the president came in with a delegation, including, of course, Roman Schwarzman, the survivor who we heard from there was hush in the chamber. And the only sound you would occasionally hear was a photographer trying to move around to get a better position. So there was a real sense of, you know, parliamentary business is suspended, and this is a moment to recollect for the crimes of the Holocaust. But then there were also a couple of ways in which today's ceremony was very contemporary and did take on a political edge. As we heard from Roman Schwarzman there, directly comparing Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine with Hitler, saying that Hitler tried to exterminate me because I was a Jew. Now Putin is trying to exterminate me because I'm Ukrainian, and making a very firm call on Germany to step up its support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia's invasion. So that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, President Steinmeier, so the federal president of Germany, this ceremonial position with the kind of highest authority in the state, making a very strong plea that even if 80 years have passed since the Holocaust, such a long time has passed, that with the passage of time, the crimes do not become smaller. They can never be forgotten. And I think part of his comments were really aimed at the discussion that has come around with Elon Musk's entry into German politics. At the weekend, many viewers may remember that he appeared virtually at a party conference of the AfD and told the assembled people there that there has been too much focus in Germany on its historical guilt and that Germany needs to move on from that. President Steinmeier very firmly making the case that this is not something that you can draw a line under. This is not something that you can move on from. The crimes of the Holocaust were of a historical, unique significance, and any attempt to move on from that would be an abandonment of the very principle of German democracy.
President Steinmeier's line there can be no end to our responsibility. And the story that we heard from Roman Schwarzman of a 5-year-old boy who suffered such horrors, these are the stories that make it real, that make it not just history, that bring it home to us.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is part of the worry that you feel within Germany and that you feel, I think, in many parts of the world that, you know, with greater passage of time, you know, it's now 80 years. Anyone who remembers the Holocaust was likely a child or a teenager during that time. In another 5 years, there will be fewer and fewer witnesses, fewer and fewer people who can give that personal testimony of what happened. And how do you sustain a culture of memory around these events when those witnesses are no longer there? Steinmeier is saying that we're going to have to find new forms of remembering, and you see the involvement of young people very much in the occasions today. But I think, yeah, this is going to be, I think, a major struggle between this kind of Elon Musk idea supporting the far-right AfD, saying we need to move on from that, and others saying, no, these are historical crimes of unique global significance, and any attempt to move on would totally undermine Germany's standing with the world.
OK, thanks for that, Richard. Richard Walker is our chief international editor. Watching DW live from Berlin. As a quick reminder of our top story, the German Parliament has held a ceremony of remembrance for victims of the Nazi regime. Commemorations come 80 years after the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp in Poland, where more than 1 million people were murdered during the Second World War, most of them Jews. That's it. You're up to date. More at the top of the hour. Have a good day.